Yeah, okay. So, I'm Jan Slaby. I'm a professor of philosophy in Berlin at the Freie Universität, the area of philosophy of mind. My interests lie mainly in the intersection of the social and the mental. So what I call at times a political philosophy of mind. When in this perspective, you ask how specific living conditions, institutions, technology, social practices, media intersect with our individual mentality, our subjectivity, and how subjectivity is basically formed. So it's really a perspective that wants to understand the human subject in its time, in its specific social setting. And so that's where philosophy probably intersects with a lot of other disciplines like social science, cultural studies, anthropology, and so on. And of course, it is an interesting, I hope, perspective on the way certain sciences, fields in the cognitive sciences are relevant to how the mind actually works. And I think, Alyosha, you're interested in similar topics because you're also a philosopher. So maybe we can kind of agree quite early on that we are in a specific relation to cognitive science and the mind sciences, probably not a relation of wholehearted endorsement, more of a skeptical, critical position, probably a certain distance to these fields while we are still, in a way, interested by them, fascinated by them. But so maybe that's the first question to you also, after you introduce yourself, how your specific relationship is to cognitive science and the neuroscience, maybe the brain science. And I can also tell you a little bit about my specific take here, but I don't want to speak too long at the beginning. So eager to learn what your perspective is.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Aljoša Kravanja, and I'm currently a researcher in fields of criminology and philosophy. And I also work as a translator, mostly from French. The projects that I've been currently working for is, of course, my thesis that I just finished just a few months ago on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. That's basically it. I think that Kantian philosophy and philosophy of German idealism do have a special relationship to neuroscience, because at the first glance they're dealing with a common topic, subjectivity, but from two completely opposite or different viewpoints. So I'm kind of professionally inclined to be critical towards neuroscience and cognitive science, absolutely, and I think I try to overcome it somehow by thinking about it, not only in critical terms. So
on Kant, that's a whole universe. So was it in the critique of pure reason? Was it on the theoretical philosophy or something else?
Yeah, I've written a thesis on critique of judgment, and the main reason is that I actually tried to sidestep main theoretical issues of Kantian philosophy. Because critique of pure reason is, I think, justifiably read as the main critique of the three works. So that's the main reason I wrote a thesis on critique of judgment. So there are actually two paragraphs or a short segment in critique of judgment that have been read very widely by people such as Schelling or Hegel. Those are paragraphs 76 and 77. And basically what I've done in my thesis is I analyzed those two paragraphs kind of very deeply, should I say. So that's that.
Well, that's far removed from much of what you get in neuroscience, for sure.
Yeah, I think so.
It always strikes me on what high conceptual level Kant was actually working. As philosophers, we can grapple all our lives with just 50 pages of his work, I would say, or with just the concept of understanding or the concept of judgment. I mean, Kant's theory of judgment is amazing from today's perspective, and also so little understood in many quarters of philosophy. And then going from there to, you know, to all the big claims about the brain and about how neuroscience can now understand how decision-making, for instance, works, or how, well, also certain perceptual judgments are arrived at. That can be quite hard. And that was part of my way into a critical perspective on neuroscience. Some of this discrepancy in terms of the level of understanding that is actually reached on the one side, and then the exaggerated appearance of neuroscientists in today's climate, where science has a certain high standing in society, regardless of whether people understand what the science is actually about, or how it actually works to have a study in neuroscience that actually has any results and that actually tells us anything about, well, mental phenomena. And, well, all these difficult processes are really hardly understood, but still there's some sort of default credibility lent to all of the, well, narratives or results or whatever comes out of neuroscience. And that can make it quite difficult to, well, yeah, to position yourself as a philosopher outside of the narrow circles of the Kant insiders or Hegelians or so on. So has that been an issue for you during your studies or during your interaction in university? Or was it not a problem that you live in a time where neurocognitive sciences seem so prominent culturally?
Yeah, I think that I think it's a broader problem, I guess, not only limited to, of course, to my situation, that the scientific and mostly philosophical projects that get state funding usually have to be concerned with neuroscience, or they have to be termed in the framework of neuroscience. So, for instance, it's more likely to get state funding if you frame a project in criminology in neuroscientific terms than in, you know, conventional terms of criminology. So, of course, as you know, most likely the same is with philosophy. You know, it's harder to get state-funded project that deals only with Kant or with German idealism. You have to add that, you know, neuroscientific part. And the problem is, of course, that this is usually, just an artificial add-on or something. It really doesn't concern the actual theory that you're dealing with. So yeah, I think that neuroscience, not as a science, but rather the standings it has in society, is problematic in this view, I think. Yeah.
Well, and that was part of what a few collaborators and I thought a few years ago, that we can take neuroscience actually as an angle or as a topic to investigate the current situation of, well, what it means to be human today, or what it means to do research on the human. So you could kind of turn the tables on neuroscience a little bit and take it as a test case of how certain types of knowledge are produced in this specific setting. Like how, for instance, some studies are just done because they will generate public impact, like work on the adolescent brain or work on the criminal brain. You could be sure that, well, there will be some sort of uptake and you will get funding for it and so on, and also work on, well, the alleged non-existence of freedom of the will that we all determined and so on, or that there's some programming in the brain that is from the Stone Age. So there are all these kind of nice narratives that I don't know, the public can understand. And but when you try to investigate neuroscience as such, you kind of see how knowledge production in neoliberal times actually works. And I don't mean this in this sort of shady blame game type of thing, but rather you can really see also how professional scientists are forced to channel their topics and also the whole outlook of their research groups through these discourses. And there are various examples, like work on empathy. It's a big industry, social cognition and empathy, where you see that. And there's really interesting work to be done here, also in social psychology, but it always has to be kind of framed through a certain template to make it, I don't know, timely, to make it understandable. And that's kind of interesting, because you see that I think there are a lot of kind of well-meaning people, of course, in neuroscience, but they have to play by these rules of framing the topics in specific ways. And at the same time, you see in these discourses or these specific discourses about subjectivity, how our time actually understands people, how people should be governed, what image of education do you have, what image of child rearing do you have, what image of dangerous subjects do you have, and what sorts of policies are put forth. And you kind of always see it. It's almost in a Hegelian sense. You see how neuroscience encapsulates some sort of essence of our time in these entanglements with different practices. And I think that was our attempt to kind of turn the tables and take critical neuroscience as a way to do philosophy of our time. So it kind of mixes philosophy of science and critique of science with a kind of a more sociologically diagnostic approach to the present. And I think that's one way to, as a philosopher, to kind of keep your sanity in of these developments.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that neuroscience is like naturally compatible with neoliberalism?
Well, in some respects, I think it's kind of a poster child of neoliberalism on various levels. For one, the way it has taken up certain discourses. Well, you could talk about networks, brain networks, and network subjectivities. You could speak about human capital theory, how there's a certain background discourse in neuroscience which is about, well, the resources, the potentials that an individual has and that you can cultivate in order to have it marketable, ready for you. And I think this is the discourse that kind of one-to-one was adopted by neuroscience, also in the whole discussion of neuroplasticity.
Yeah, absolutely.
The message is, well, your brain is not hardwired, but you can train it, you can cultivate it, and it's flexible. It makes you kind of apt to be a network individual in the workplace and so on. And I wouldn't say that it's kind of a straightforward adoption, but it's a sort of tacit osmosis of discursive elements. Well,
yeah, I think that coincidences played much role in my interest in Immanuel Kant. The fact is that in Ljubljana we have quite a strong school of Kantian and also Hegelian interpretation. We have scholars such as Žižek and Mladen Dolar and Alenka Zupančič, Rado Riha, Zdravko Kobe, who are well known not only in Slovenia but also abroad. So I think that in Slovenia at our faculty of arts, it's kind of natural. If you want to do philosophy seriously, then you study Kant or Hegel. It's a kind of a convention, you know. And the reason why I chose critique of judgment as my topic of dissertation is the one I mentioned earlier, because I wanted to sidestep the main theoretical issues and deal with those more marginal problems of Kantian philosophy. But on a more general level, like the reason why I and now I write my articles at all is because I just want to figure things out, because I only I like to see how concepts interact and then perhaps present that conceptual interactions in a way that is enjoyable to other people. And I think that is my main motivation of intellectual work. So that's that.
Yeah, these are great answers to the very difficult question for a philosopher. What is the motivation? I mean, there's always this sort of general thing that you want to figure things out for humanity or what it means to be human. And I think there's this general level of very deep motivation that probably makes you a philosopher. But then, of course, you're a child of your times, and we already spoke about neuroscience and about the kind of urge to respond to developments that we find problematic. So there's this sort of critical impulse. And so for me, part of the motivation has always been this squaring these two things. Like there's a legacy of philosophy where you have authors from 2,500 years ago that kind of speak to us still and tell us something about human nature, about what it means to be human. But at the same time, we know that we live in a time where things are radically different than any time before in history, and it's probably a very dangerous time, also politically. And so, and philosophy has, I think, this urge to kind of respond to what's going on out there in the world of politics and in history. So, and it's of course very difficult to bring these aspects together. But on the other hand, it's obvious that when you read Kant, for instance, or Aristotle, that they speak directly not only to a perennial dimension of what it means to be a rational being, but they kind of directly address our political nature and address an ethos in each of us, an ethos of rationality. And I sometimes, although we tend to be kind of pragmatic about our decisions and we have to navigate a complex institutional landscape, there's still this sort of fascination in philosophy to square human nature on the one hand, or the nature of being a rational being, with addressing the concrete historical time in which we are living. And I think that's one of the questions I think you wanted us to address, the way that our research is responding to the current situation, politically, historically, or whether we are just immersed in academic affairs. And I think all our answers point in this direction, that these things go together. But it's always uneasy. It's always an uneasy interaction between the vagaries of the day and what philosophy is about conceptually. So I wonder how you respond to this challenge of being up to your time and at the same time standing in this perennial conversation of philosophy.
Yeah, I think that fundamentally there are two ways that philosophy can address the problems of its time. One is to see in what is actual, in what exists today, a particular case of already known general philosophical notions. And the other way, which is, I think, fundamentally different, is that philosophy can understand its own actuality or contemporary existence and society as cases of something new that have to be thought in a radically new way. So yeah, I think that philosophers are naturally inclined to see, to actually think in the first way, to see what is actual merely as a particular case of a general philosophical notions. And you see Trump and you see Trump's victory or Brexit, and you say, aha, look, there's a return of the notion of sovereignty or something like that. But you can sidestep that inclination and say that, and try to think things as something radically new. And the second way perhaps is harder, but philosophers such as Michel Foucault and Hannah Arendt tried to explicitly try to go that way. And I think that we should follow their example.
Maybe there's a middle way when you see how the philosophical ethos probably is affected by the current climate. So it's not really, it must not be on the level of contents, concepts, questions you ask, but probably on the way that you position yourself, or the way that you, or what issues you find suddenly urgent. I mean, there was a time in the 90s where I was trained in analytical philosophy. People were kind of happy to talk about very tiny conceptual issues that were of no relevance whatsoever, you could say, to general human affairs. And you could say, well, at least in the West, it was a kind of time where people were well off, and the big problems seemed to be settled, you know. And it was a sort of boring time where people had time to, you know, consume or do intricate little things for their passions. And now that has changed a little bit, I think. Now, and I see it in my students, they are very eager to address topics of political relevance, be it in terms of race or the rise of populism. Or I work a lot on emotion and affect. And there was also a long time in philosophy where emotion theory was kind of boring. It was about, well, media amplified political affect. It's about hatred. It's about climates of fear. It's the way we find things relevant, and also how, on what level you formulate your philosophical questions. So maybe that's another factor. Well, speaking of the topic of affect, have you ever thought about affect and emotion in your philosophy, or is that something that you were never thought about?
Well, a few years ago, I actually wrote an article about Dostoevsky and the notion of suffering, which was dealing mostly with with affectivity, and I found the philosophy of Michel Henry extremely interesting, especially in this view. But yeah, what I've noticed this year while dealing with critical judgment is how Kantian take to the notion of affectivity in critical judgment is actually, you know, always secondary. Like, you have this first layer, which is the layer of judgment, and then only secondary, perhaps, Kant's analysis get to the analysis of affectivity. And yeah, I found that quite interesting, and this is perhaps a general problem with Kantian thinking.
Yeah, we should not go there, otherwise we would use all our time speaking about Kant's theory of judgment. I think one point that we are expected to address is creativity in thought, and I think I would say we have talked about that already, that the way I think creativity happens, at least for me, is often about responding to things that kind of concern my wider circle of influence. So it's about what happens in conversations, what happens with people that show up in seminars or at workshops. So that's but of course it's always a difficult question for philosophers to ask about what the sources of your creativity are. And I'm almost a little embarrassed by this question, apart from, you know, all these sort of trivialities about, it's conversing with people. And sometimes we are kind of reading a big philosopher and we get inspired. But I think I don't really know what makes me, if the little creativity I have, I don't know where it comes from, actually. So maybe you have a better answer. Yeah,
I notice a general pattern, at least in my writing, that like my most general creative process begins usually with discovering an interesting idea, that at least at first sight seems interesting to me. And then when I start writing about it, then I usually find out that that idea is actually crap, you know, false or a mere stereotype. And then what I actually write about is precisely the reason why that first idea is crap, you know. And I think that is the most general work process, at least for my work, that perhaps others might recognize with them as well.
That sounds plausible. We kind of litter our way with mistakes and errors and wrong turns, and maybe that's really different in philosophy than in other fields, but I'm not sure. Well, the public, that's our topic, and I mean, I guess it's again an answer that we have to give here that is kind of mixed and balanced, and says, well, on the one hand, we are funded by the public, most of us, if we are happy enough to have a job, and the public has some sort of right to see what we are up to, and of course, our interventions, particularly when they are critical and political, they should have an impact. And so I can easily tell people why I critique neuroscience, because I think the real waste of money happens here. When you have a research program that is funded by billions and billions, think of the Human Brain Project of the EU, it's 1 billion euros or so for the next 10 years. And I think it's very important to make people understand that there is a lot of problematic stuff going on in science, and also to explain people that it's normal that science takes risks, but also takes wrong turns, and that there's an institutional dimension to it, a political dimension to it, and you need to have an assessment of that, and then at some point say, well, probably the funding is misdirected here, or we should be very cautious about the results, and so on. So I think that's a straightforward case where I think the public can follow what we do, even people that are not trained. In other parts of philosophy, that is more difficult. I mean, talking about people, why we inquire into the nature of agency or subjectivity in this sort of very detached theoretical terms, I think it's there are lots of mediated steps in between before these issues that Kant probably grapples with, or that contemporary Kantians grapple with, until they arrive at a point where you can make arguments that the public needs to respond to that. Maybe as a Kantian, when you look at the conflict of the faculties or something like that, where Kant defends the importance of freedom for the unfolding of rationality in a public sphere, maybe that's a point where you can say, well, every member of the public should be interested in that, because without it, there wasn't any sort of public anymore. So maybe you have to take on that.
Yeah.
Kant is a versatile weapon.
Yeah, I completely agree with you in the sense that I also think that as a philosopher that is, or at least that was founded by the public, I do have some obligation to present my findings in a accessible way, in a way that is not accessible only to professionals, because like the main output, or perhaps the only output of philosophy is, of course, words. The output of natural sciences or technical sciences are results. Results in form of concrete objects. But philosophy, in the last instance, produces words, and it is, I think, very hard, if not impossible, to justify publicly funded philosophy that is only accessible to professionals only, and that is the case. That is greatly seen, can be seen in studying Kant. Absolutely, yeah. And yeah, so I agree with you. But on the other hand, yeah, Kant himself, in context of faculties, stated that the faculty of arts and philosophy in particular has an inherent relation to public as such, and so is in a sense necessary for it. But if a philosopher proposes such a claim, in a public space, that the public itself is in a way dependent on him, it's an outrageous claim in the last instance. And philosophers, he or she should not expect that the public will receive that claim well, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we could talk all night about Kant, I guess. I mean, the thing is, you have Kant's deduction of the categories, the transcendental deduction, and that's probably one of the most complicated pieces of philosophy ever to be written down. So the thing is, you could say, well, we need people to be experts on this, but you cannot expect from them to kind of readily relate what's in there to something that, a shopkeeper around the corner needs to know. But on the other hand, that's the thing, that the wager is that is about human understanding or human subjectivity, so the very core of what we are. And it's kind of not surprising that is a riddle and that's very difficult. And so I think we have to find a way just to convey to people what is the game that Kant is playing, while we shouldn't probably play it in a way that everybody can follow, because that's probably impossible. We could kind of present to people what the stakes are of this sort of philosophy, and that that it matters how we think about ourselves as, well, self-determined, potentially rational, free individuals, and what that means. Or what would it mean to not think of ourselves in these terms, but kind of to deny freedom, to deny autonomy, to deny the possibility of self-determination? What would that mean? So, I don't know. Maybe Kant is a good topic to kind of settle on here, and because he kind of carries this understanding of what it means, or why it is a good idea to be a rational being, even though it's hard.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, Kant is interesting here also because he himself was not only a professional philosopher, but also an author of popular essays written about everything from human races to politics and reading habits. So I think Kant himself is in a way an example of how a philosopher even today, I think, can present his philosophical findings also in accessible way.
Right. Yeah, and that's why I would understand my own project also as a Kantian project in a certain sense of critique. And the concept of Kant's concept of critique is very complex, of course, but there's also this sort of straightforward sense of critique, namely that there's so much bullshit around, and you can, if you are a person of understanding, you at some point you have probably an obligation to tell people what is bullshit out there. Yeah. And that's some of what we have tried to do with certain concepts like empathy, like resilience, like neuroplasticity. Mm-hmm. There are certain things that are kind of exported from science into the public that are really, either incoherent or problematic or politically one-sided, or in terms of the concept of resilience, that embodies a whole worldview about subjects that struggle for self-preservation, that try to get ready for a catastrophe. And there's a whole outlook in which the world seems to be on the verge of catastrophe and so on. But on the other hand, the term is promoted by certain agencies that kind of want a specific type of subject. And I think there's a kind of straightforward sense of critique, of enlightening people about what's actually in this concept and why it is probably not such a good idea to promote it in that way. And I think that's still in the broadest sense, a Kantian endeavor.
Yeah, but additional problem is that that public will, especially today, I think, always answer you back with, who are you to tell us what is bullshit? I think that there is a general resentment towards professionals that try to determine what is bullshit, what is not bullshit. For instance, let's take the term fake news that has recently it came to the front. I think that this term is in itself a bit patronizing, to the public, and the public kind of course, quickly recognize that. And I think that especially today, the task of public critique performed by philosopher or intellectual in general is, how should I put it, at risk, or perhaps less effective than was in 90s, I think, or in 80s. So yeah, and I think that has something to do with the internet, you know, with communication being accessible to everyone, and professionals not having privileged voice in discussion. So I think that that today task of critique is hard. You know.
Yeah, it's hard. But I mean, I wonder what would you think is a right response to that situation? Would you say that philosophers just have to go on doing what they do because they know that they're doing the right thing, or would you say that because the parameters, the whole outlook of the public sphere has changed because of the internet, that we have to change our ways, our practices, the way we address the public, the modes of communication, habits of publication, and so on? What would you think? I'm very interested in that.
Yeah, that's a hard question, I think. But I think that the most general strategy should be that public intellectuals should not present themselves as professionals, but rather as someone actually from the public, you know, or from the people. That is, because the main reason I think that professional speech today produces so much resentment is that people that because intellectuals present themselves as professionals, and that I think naturally produces a resentment reaction. So yeah, I think the general strategy is that intellectuals should avoid presenting themselves as intellectuals. So that's
okay, well, that's. I see where you're driving it, but it's a slippery slope, of course. I mean, you cannot completely hide your education, or your status, your standing, and so on. Although I see what you're driving at. I think what part of the point might be to use all sorts of venues for communication, not only the official interview or the newspaper article and all these, you know, big stages where professors usually speak from, but rather engage in all sorts of informal communication channels, but then make sure that you're kind of doing what you always did, namely be a critical voice, be a voice of reason, and be consistent in that, and not kind of, you know, faking it a little bit in order to be better perceived. Now, for me, the best way to work collectively was usually a partnership with one individual, like two people writing a paper, or two people, maybe three, but mostly two people that kind of have some overlap in their intuitions or in their intentions, and then find a common ground. But you cannot do it all the time, because then you have to move on to do something on your own or find someone else for a different interest. So I have a rather big network of co-authors, and sometimes I see them only like for one week a year, and we do a little thing, and then, you know, do something together, and I don't see the person for another year, and so on. And but that's great, because at some point you have there are certain ideas that resonate with certain people, although you don't have much in common with these people. And so I always look for these sort of alliances. It's not the same as a scientific research group where people are hired in the same lab and interact every day. That's more difficult, probably. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that writing philosophy in co-authorship is actually quite hard, because like the main thing that the main principle that philosopher has to follow is consistency, and you can't be consistent with someone else. You can only be consistent with yourself. And I think that that philosophy in that view is writing philosophy in authorship is in that view quite hard, because like philosophy doesn't have this external object that various authors can, you know, agree upon, but rather it produces text, and that text has to have its own internal consistency And yeah, I actually don't imagine how I would write philosophy with someone else, actually. So
interesting. Yeah, I know. I mean, the two things about that. It's always easier when you do it in terms of a text that is more sociological or in neuroscience, we had a lot of texts that were probably, you could say they're science and technology studies in the broadest sense. That was a little easier because you could kind of divide the texts up into sections, and the sections were a little different and nobody really cared. In philosophy, you really have to look for a person who shares an intuition about a topic. Mm-hmm. So, and often there are people that I know quite well, where I think, okay, we disagree on a lot of things, but here there's a point in Aristotle where we agree on a certain concept, and we just write a paper on that concept, and it's still difficult. But then I think we meet on a certain common ground, and you need a lot of conversation to find the common ground, but then can be great fun. And also, I'm a lazy person. I like it when someone else writes my papers, and I can send them half a paper, and they... Yeah. Philosophy can have a characteristic motivation problem when you're on your own all the time. It can be really tiring, and because writing is also, it's a hard process, I guess, for most people. So if there's someone else who can kind of pick up the slack from time to time, that's great.
Right.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Bye.